think part of it is getting back to focusing on the positive aspects. I've been focusing on the negative because I work in mental health, and there's a lot of negative stuff going on. I think I could talk about that for years. And there's positive stuff too, of course. But I feel like I want to focus on the gifts, and one of the gifts is this hyper learning. And what does this hyper learning want to learn and move towards? And is there a sustainable way to be in that consciousness? And I actually feel like manic consciousness is the new consciousness. It's playful, it's joyous, and if you look at the scale of consciousness by Dr. David Hawkins, those are the higher states of consciousness. And our brain goes there, but it's difficult to actually stay there, because Ken Wilber talks about how states are temporary, and you can buy states of consciousness. You can be in a high state, just by taking some kind of illicit drug, whereas the stages are actually earned. So how do we embody our mania and harvest our mania and move towards practicing it to actually get to the stage of joy and playfulness and love, not just having that as a state? The state we get a lot of times just organically through our own endogenous biomolecules. It's all, we can create them ourselves. And it's a matter of, I think it's a matter of how do we design our life that is that joyful, that we're creating those biomolecules endogenously, automatically. And that's part of manic lifestyle design. How do we design our life? Because when we're in that consciousness, we act in different ways. We're random, we're spontaneous, we're creative, we're playful. How do we design our life to just be that way? And then we're almost earning that state by creating our life in that way. And by creating our life in that way, we're actually in alignment with the universe and what the universe would want for us. The universe doesn't want us to be habitual, programmed, robotic drones. It wants us to be one with life. And I was listening to a talk by Eckhart Tolle, and somebody asked, what's the significance or what's the point of mental illness or something? And he sort of was beating around the bush for a while, and then he actually talked about it in terms of suffering, because his thing is about how suffering leads to awakening, or it can. And then something he did talk about was that it's all one life, it's all one consciousness. It's not separate, like it's not my life and your life, it's just life. So I liked that reminder of the whole oneness thing. It's life. And I think that's what actually happens when we go into manic consciousness, is we're just one with life. Like that's actually the energy of life. That's the energy that feeds the plants. That's the energy that feeds all creatures on earth. But we've sort of separated ourselves from that life energy by thinking. And I think in the end we all get returned to that life energy, because it is just one life. It's like I'm life and somebody else is life, and we're interacting. Well, are we interacting based on the principles of life? Or are we interacting based on these rules of thought that we've created with our dividing minds to keep ourselves separate? And I was thinking about how lately I've been struggling with some so-called anxiety, and I haven't really created any stories in my mind about it, so I felt it mostly as pain in my body. And then sometimes I'll have a little bit of a story come up as to what it could be related to, and it could be something from years ago or now or whenever. And what I'm thinking though is, usually I don't feel this kind of anxiety. I go into a state of terror pretty quickly, and then I dissociate, and then I end up in the psych ward. And it's a pretty quick process of like a week or a few days. But it seems like instead I've been feeling physical pain or sort of emotional pain. And if a little bit of a story comes up, I have a sense of when that's from. So I'm feeling the euphoric sensation. I'm feeling when it's from. Instead of being in terror, quickly dissociating and having no sense of the time and where things are coming from. It just feels like terror, and that means that things are coming to an end for me right now. So it feels like it's drawn out. So by not maybe tumbling down into the very low states of consciousness so quickly, I'm maybe in still low states, but they're painful, but they're manageable, as opposed to maybe that's part of the things. The lower states are so painful that my consciousness can't manage it, so then I dissociate from myself, and I can't remain myself. And also too, I don't take any extra medication for these pains or these feelings of anxiety, whereas if I go into those extreme states and I dissociate, I end up in the psych ward on extra medication. So I'd rather not take the extra medication and just feel it. I might have already talked about that stuff because I got lost on my list here. I was thinking about the evolution of consciousness and why would we go backwards in consciousness? Why would we go down the scale of consciousness if generally in life our body grows bigger and we don't grow smaller, and as we mature emotionally, usually it just sort of gets a little bit more evolved over time, usually, or learning, we learn more and more, and that sort of increases our capacity to learn. But it seems like consciousness, it doesn't happen that way. So I could get to a high level of consciousness and then go back down. And I'm wondering if it's sort of because that consciousness isn't ours, it's not personal, it's not my consciousness, it's sort of consciousness being expressed through me, so consciousness can change its expression through me depending on how things go. And I almost think it's sort of like breathing. Like we breathe in, we breathe out, and the same with consciousness. We go up and down. Consciousness, especially for people who are in bipolar, and in a way, people who are in consciousness of bipolar is sort of more of a barometer of the planet, because we can go up and down consciousness so readily, and it's showing that we're not actually our personalities. We are consciousness, and we're going up and down and being breathed by consciousness in a way. And I think part of it too is that when we're caught in that habitual lifestyle and then consciousness comes in as bipolar, it starts breathing us. We're trying to find where we want to actually settle into a different lifestyle, not in that habitual lifestyle. So normally recovery is to get us back into some kind of habit similar to our past habits, whereas this energy is wanting us to live in a completely different way, living in a life that is beyond habit, because this consciousness is going to come in and disrupt whatever it is we're trying to habitually do. So that would be like trying to climb a wave versus actually just surfing a wave. And so I think part of it is getting with that wave. And just as far, out in the beginning of a wave, it's like this huge wave. As it gets closer to the shore, it's a very light wave. So I think even though it starts, we're breathing up like this, sort of like big waves, eventually as it gets to the shore, we probably will even out, but that's as long as we're actually going with the wave. Like, where is this wave trying to take us? I think it's trying to wave us out of our personality, for one. And that's another thing, when I was watching that video about learning or neuroplasticity, manic consciousness definitely wants to learn, and it definitely wants to be creative. And not just creative in one little aspect, it wants to be creative in all of life. So how can one make every moment a creative act? And since it is a learning process, and it sort of wants this overstimulation, well, what kind of overstimulation? Because the manic energy makes everything overstimulating. And I think part of it has to do with just harvesting mania, going back to that experience and trying to recall and remember the rules, the unseen rules, the unwritten rules. It's sort of like giving us a map to this game, seeing how it really works, and then coming back, if we could actually harness that, that might be really powerful, because most people think it works in this linear, logical, reductionist way. But I think it works in a different way. And if I think about it, we're in sort of the age of reason. And Sean Blackwell talks about spiral dynamics and the levels of evolution of worldview, and how there's the modern, postmodern, and then I think he calls the last one the power of now way. And the power of now level, he talks about how people will be at this high level of consciousness, but they see there's a place for all levels of consciousness. It's not just about trying to get everyone to be this higher level of consciousness, but honoring all levels. And I feel like, for example, I'm a vegetarian, but I'm not the kind of vegetarian that feels like everybody should be a vegetarian. If somebody else wants to eat meat, that's whatever. So to me, that would be kind of like a power of now level of consciousness, because I'm not trying to push my ways on other people. That doesn't help. If other people want to become vegetarian one day, cool. I've been vegan and then not vegan. I've been vegan and then vegetarian, and maybe one day I'll eat meat for some reason. I can't imagine that I will, but I can't say for sure that I won't. And part of that level too would be seeing that the mental health paradigm has its place as well. I don't feel like I want to work in it for very much longer, but it does have its place. It does help some people. It has helped me. Doesn't mean that I don't want to transcend it, because I do want to transcend it. And I think part of transcending it is actually getting with learning what this energy wants me to learn and stepping into that. It's wanting brains to take a certain other function, and when I think about that, when I get back to thinking about that, I think about Dr. David Hawkins' scale of consciousness, and how after the level of reason is actually the level of, I think it's love or joy. It could be love and then joy, or just love and then joy, but I actually feel like when I was in mania, I was in the level of joy, because it actually talks about this sort of oneness of consciousness, and how I think actually that level of life is love and joy. And there's that oneness, like everything just feels like that joy. Every person one meets feels like that joy, and one can almost experience that person in that level of joy. And that could be the trouble, is that being in that level of consciousness, it's like being in oneness and bringing everyone up to that. But it can only last for so long, because that's not actually the collective resonance of how life is. So then one sort of gets shot in the other direction in order to compensate. And I think it's not that one can't get back. I think one can get back there. But it's a matter, again, of earning it through embodied mania, earning those stages versus waiting for the states to come. Because the states aren't earned, and I think the way one earns it is actually earning it neuroplastically and neurologically, from epigenetics to DNA to glial cells to neurons to everything. It has to be really embedded in the neurophysiology. And if you can imagine that, if a person is just a producer and creator of joy, and just joyful, their whole body is going to vibrate with that. But if one gets into that state of joy through mania and has never been there before, it only makes sense that it's not going to last forever. It sort of like lays the foundation of some of the neural pathways, but we have to actively build on those neural pathways, and that could be the learning. The mania is the learning of the universe that gives us that blueprint, and then it says, hey, now what are you going to do with this blueprint? And most of us have our blueprint crumpled up and thrown away, and our brains and our neural pathways medicated in preventing that from happening again. But I think it's important to actually embody one's mania, and I think that's why altruism as part of the healing process is very important. I talked about that paper by Dr. Roger Walsh that says services need to be redesigned to have altruism one of the first steps, like even when a person is still suffering, to help other people. And I think that's part of the manic consciousness lifestyle design, is just going out and being randomly helpful and kind. And if I wonder about it, if I'm curious about it, all I have to do is just remember how I was in that state, and why am I not being that way now? I think going backwards in consciousness is actually a release in entropy in a way. There's like information is released. Whereas in higher states of consciousness, we're able to sort of integrate everything. It's sort of everything is one. It's made part of us as we go. Whereas when we come back down, we see ourselves again as separate and see all this information, and that extra information coming out could actually be part of some of the hallucinations and the delusions and the fear, because we're sort of withdrawn from that state of oneness, and now from that state of one, there's the many, and there's more information coming out. And I think that's part of what's important with coming down to those lower states of consciousness, is that it's not really meant as a punishment or anything, but it's meant to show us what it is that we're here to work for, which is to eliminate and alleviate a lot of that suffering that we have to experience within our consciousness, because a lot of it that we experience within our consciousness is not even our own suffering. It's all this extra suffering. We're thinking, where the heck did this come from? It's just so extreme. Well, somebody out there is feeling that. So again, it's like our own internal compass. It's not, to me, about recovering one's own personal, individual little life. In bipolar, we go from feeling oneness to separateness, to oneness to separateness. Well, how do we feel more of that oneness? How do we create more of that oneness? How do we be that oneness for other people? So we're used to having this consistent personality, but consciousness is actually an oscillation. It's an up and a down, because it's just one consciousness. It's not every person has their own consciousness. It's impersonal. And the ego makes things personal, and that's why consciousness comes in and breaks up the ego and shows us that life isn't personal. It can be very joyous when we don't make it such a personal thing. Earlier today, before I watched that TED Talk about the neuroplasticity, the woman who healed a major deficit in her brain that she was told she would have for life, I wrote that I really want to help people get their 25 years back, and not just get 25 years back, but see that they have gifts, and that this process is evolutionary and it's non-personal, and we actually have a huge responsibility to come together as a neurotribe to actually help the world. We actually need to help the people who think they need to help us. And so it's not necessarily about recovering from having a mental illness. It's recovering from being labeled as defective. Because just as this woman was able to solve her problem in her brain by just doing a couple of exercises, we might be able to solve our supposed brain problems by doing a couple of exercises. And I think some of them are random acts of kindness and spontaneous social behaviors, and a lot of the things that we're actually doing in mania, but actually doing those consciously with our own will, without the extra energy and help from the universe, and not waiting for the universe to kick us in the butt. Part of what I want to do has something to do with bipolar is seen as limitation, it's seen as defective, and I feel like there's just sort of a missing piece of the puzzle that if we knew, it would actually be seen as desirable. Just like this lady who was able to do certain exercises in terms of some kind of activity she designed to get her brain to sort of spark on. What is it that would make the bipolar brain spark on and actually find some kind of harmony with this world? Because usually when I've had a crisis of some kind, I'm actually close to thriving. And that could be part of it, actually, is getting to the upper limits of consciousness. Consciousness throws me back into the mud to say, oh, you have a lot more to learn. And then I think, well, what would it want me to learn? It seems it wants me to learn about human suffering. And this woman, she changed her brain by doing some kind of exercises that she designed to help that area of her brain. And if a woman can do that, of course the universe can come in and change our brains with the energy of the universe. If a human can just sit down and go do and then over time change their brain, well, the universe can come in and go and change the brain too. And I actually feel like bipolar and these other things that happen to people is actually new cognition. So they talk about cognition and precognition. I think this is actually new cognition. This is consciousness evolution. And it's a type of processing we don't fully understand. And I watched another talk. This man was talking about how the brain is 10% neurons and 90% glial cells, and how the glial cells are much more important than is ever said or thought. And I actually think that they talk about how flow is transient hypofrontality. The prefrontal cortex turns off, and then all of a sudden we're more in the present moment and all these great things. Well, it could be shifting more to the glial cells. Maybe neurons are actually more like scar tissue than actual, maybe glial cells are actually being one with life. It's a mirror of exactly what's out there and being one with that in the moment, whereas the neurons are thinking about stuff. And I think that the universe wanted us to create all of these structures we have now, but now it's like, okay, it's time for the prefrontal cortex to shut down. We've created enough too fast, and it's time for it to shut down, and it's shutting it down in a lot of brains, and we're switching to these glial cell processes, and then the brains that are neuron dominant are actually thinking that this is pathology, this happening. But it's actually, I think, evolutionary, because we don't really need to be abstracting about reality as much. Now is actually just being one with reality and what we've created, and actually enjoying it and being joyful. And I think that's partly what happens in bipolar, is that there's that hypofrontality, that prefrontal cortex abstracting about stuff shuts down, and one is just one with the creative process and being creative for no particular reason except to be joyous and celebrate. So it's kind of like this time now to sort of enjoy the fruits of the labors of humanity and all the generations before us, and actually slow down. But our brains are so programmed into that progress that we don't really actually enjoy the progress that we've made. And I think that's why the universe is shutting down the prefrontal cortex and starting to create different brains. And that's the thing, that it's consciousness that directs all of this. We think, oh, there's DNA this and DNA that. Yeah, that's true to a certain extent, but consciousness is more fundamental than that. Yeah, so new cognition, and it's just a type of processing that we don't understand. And I felt it in the past as information overload. And I'm wondering too if this process of self-dialogue could help with information overload, in that at least I'm speaking, I'm giving voice to some of the information that goes through me, and in that way sort of making it manifest, instead of sort of having it swirling around inside of me and having to play with my energy through the entropic process. And so it's actually making it manifest instead of just having things always swirling around. Because if manic consciousness is part of the learning process, then by speaking to myself, I'm helping myself learn and integrate what I've learned. And part of the learning is to not accumulate and just sort of release it and go on to the next thing. And in that way, perhaps this change in consciousness, which I feel could have something to do with entropy, with information, the change in consciousness is what releases information from the body or wherever it's stored, and then we have access to that information in consciousness, and going down to the lowest levels of consciousness, we have access to information from those low levels of consciousness, especially when we're actually in the bipolar process, because then we're actually more identified with that consciousness than we are with the present moment in our body. So then we have more access to that other information. And it breaks us out of habit. And that's one of the reasons why I feel it's important to not live in habit. So all these things that manic consciousness does, it's important to design into one's life consciously by our own free will. Because in mania, sometimes the scary part is we feel like we don't have any control. And then when we get control back, we just go back to our old ways. We don't actually listen to what that energy was trying to tell us. And not just tell us, show us through making us act certain ways physically. And then, some people hear voices. There's all these different levels of consciousness of the universe trying to communicate with us and give us some other form of compass. Then it's like an intuitive compass, and it's a different compass than the one that we're used to from our own ego consciousness. It's those ones, our own voice for our own ego consciousness. Those are all things we got from the outside. Somebody else told us something, or media, or school, or conditioning. But we don't listen to what's happening on the inside. And then no wonder sometimes the inside energy takes us over and moves us and animates us in ways that are good in some ways, and then some we don't really want. And then when we get out of that energy, we can actually choose, because we see we have more degrees of freedom than we originally thought.